we had a real good question in the Facebook group this week. Mario, who's gone through the whole mentorship already from last June's class, he had a patient in, and we talk a lot about, in one of the modules on the mentorship, we talk a lot about ribcage depression and retraction. And what Mario was saying was this patient was coming in and he was in like that sway back posture where he already looked like he's living in kind of ribcage depression and internal rotation, very anterior to translated pelvis. And there was a really good discussion about that. So, and David Gray jumped on and he was spot on in the fact that those kind of patients can look a little bit like an optical illusion sometimes, and it's really important to look specifically at what the ribcage is able to do, because a lot of the time they're going to have that forwards translation to the pelvis. And it's almost like in response to that, because we've come so far forwards here, in order to stay upright now, my only option is I need to bring my shoulders forwards. So my shoulders protract and my upper ribs might internally rotate a little bit, but actually my lower ribs can still live in a little bit of protraction and external rotation. So even for those patients, it's important to make sure that they're able to go into full ribcage internal rotation and retraction. And obviously every patient is going to be different. I'm not saying every single sway back posture person has this, but for this particular case, it was important to check that. And then Dave O'Sullivan jumped on and rightly pointed out that even though the upper ribs might be internally rotated, if they've got issues lower down or they've got issues with the scalenes, that's very important to consider as well, because then our upper ribs 1 and 2, where those scalenes are going to attach into, if someone's not able to use the diaphragm, for example, because the lower ribs are externally rotated, our scalenes now are going to pull those upper ribs into external rotation too if we're using those excessively as a breathing muscle or whatever. So some really good points there. And if you've got some tricky lower back pain patients that maybe aren't responding to the traditional stuff, just have a look at what's happening at the rib cage. What are the lower ribs doing? Are they able to fully depress? Are they able to fully retract? Are they able to fully IR? What are the upper ribs doing? Are the scalenes overworking? How are they breathing? Because that can have a massive effect on the upper rib cage too. So yeah, that was a really good question. It's great that we have so many people in the community on the Facebook group that are able to jump in and answer those questions as well. And it always leads to really good discussion. So I think there's some really good learning points that we were able to take out of that. And obviously now we can implement that into the mentorship over the next couple of weeks. Mentorship this week, we've just covered module 2. Next week we cover module 3. But the following week we'll be covering the lumbar spine. So there's going to be a lot of rib cage stuff in there, where I'm sure we'll come back to that question again. And as a group, we'll discuss that case specifically, because I think there's some really good points there.
Today's episode, I want to talk about in a little bit more detail are 3 key points. Okay, so subjective assessment. The first thing you think about when you think about subjective assessment is the questions I'm going to ask. Well, the very first post, or the supplementary post that I put into the Facebook group to help the therapist, I'm going to read it out to you in full here, is something that's not about the asking questions, okay, even though in the module 1 we focus a lot on asking higher level questions, because the higher the level of the question, the higher quality answer you'll get back. And by quality answers, I mean information that's going to help you make sense of that patient's story, make sense of their current situation, make sense of their presumably current pain experience that they're in. But the post that I put out was actually, it has subjective assessment, semicolon, listening is a combination of hearing what the other person says and involvement in what he or she says.
And check his pec clavicular and serratus anterior, because I'd imagine there's going to be something there that's not tolerating load very well, and especially if it's up at 90 degrees, I'd be thinking maybe pec clavicular, because again, if he's down here, it's going to be a lot easier for him to load, but up here, he's going to need to be able to lengthen that pec first. So the humeral attachment to the pec is going to have to lengthen, and then obviously in that position, that seems to be where he's getting more pain.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So check those 3 things with him. If they're all fine, just pop it up into the group and let us know, and we'll troubleshoot a little bit more.
Yeah.
But I'd expect probably clavicular pec, just judging on what you're saying. Again, I don't know. Obviously assess them and find out. But I'd suspect there's something there that's still not happy to tolerate load through it. So now his posterior deltoid's just taken over massively to do that instead. So again, posterior deltoids, it's a good learning point this as well. Like going into flexion, we're going to need a lot of length through posterior deltoid, and we're probably going to need actually some load through the pec. So going into flexion is probably not going to be too bad. But when we go into abduction now, posterior deltoid actually needs an output because we need to go into extension, but the pec has to lengthen quite a bit. So that's the difference between flexion and abduction, is you need a lot more length through the pec in this position. So that's why I'd expect it to be pec. If he's okay with a dumbbell down here, but he gets a barbell, it's fallen over, he gets a barbell and he struggles, I'd expect it's probably a lengthening issue, probably through the pec or something else around the shoulder.
So just going to answer some of those questions that were coming through for Monday's Q&A. So the first one was in relation to Dave's book and the 80-20 rule, and would we change that in acute cases? So the 80-20 rule is basically a concept where we're spending only 20% of the time on the symptoms and 80% of our time on the problem that have led to those symptoms in the first place. But if it's somebody with acute back pain, for example, you're right, we might spend a bit more time on the symptoms, but only for the first couple of sessions. So in the first session, if they're quite acute, I might spend 80% of the time on the symptoms and just 20% of the time on the problems. But over the course of the whole treatment plan, it's still going to apply the 80-20 rule. So by the time I get to session 3 or 4, I'm spending much more time doing the rehab on the problem rather than just desensitizing symptoms.